Last class, we ended with the question of what is the connection between increased energy demand exercise and the rate of burning or the output of CO2. So what we found out was that the things that increased in our bodies physically during exercise is an increase in sweat, an increase in your heart rate, and an increase in breathing rate, and all of these are outputs. So it increases our outputs. And this increase in outputs is an increased energy demand with exercise, increases the reaction, the one that we're looking at, in the body to cause an increase in the rate of carbon dioxide output. So all of these are signs of an increase in the rate of CO2 output. So we've seen that we produce more carbon dioxide when we exercise. We proved that in the lab. So there's a connection between exercise and the rate of the reaction that gives us energy. But now we want to make sure that we're talking about that matter, because remember we said energy and matter are used in this reaction. But so our question now is there a connection between exercise and matter? What happens to our mass when we exercise? And another word for mass is weight, but in science, the correct terminology is our mass. So let's take a look at this story. This guy was on The Biggest Loser. This is a true story, an actual contestant. And this was his before picture. He weighed 403 pounds. And he turned into this guy. So yes, the same guy. Yes, a true story. And 5 months later, he weighed 188 pounds. So my challenge question to you is, what happened to the 215 pounds of matter that the man lost? Like, where did it go? So we're going to write this down in doodle box G. So box G, I want you to take a look and figure out or think about what happened to the 215 pounds of matter that this guy lost. Because obviously it had to have gone somewhere due to the law of conservation of mass, but where did it go? What happened to it? Let's take another second and just review what we have learned so far or figured out so far. So last unit and the beginning of this unit, we reminded ourselves that food and oxygen are the inputs and our fuel that create carbon dioxide and water as our outputs. And through that reaction, we release energy for life in order to live and to do life processes. And now we know that food is made up of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. But are all these inputs used to get energy? So do we use all of these proteins, fats, and carbs to get energy? So let's try and narrow it down to figure out which of these molecules actually provide our energy. So in other words, which is our fuel? So we want to figure out which part of this is our fuel. Is it proteins, fats, carbs, and oxygen? Is it just one of them? What is our fuel? So we've seen that our production of carbon dioxide increases when we need more energy. So we have seen even more evidence that when we do something like burning food in our bodies to get energy, and we also recognize that if we exercise a lot, we get rid of some of the mass or matter when we think about that guy that I just showed you that lost all his weight from The Biggest Loser. But again, we are still wondering what the initial fuel or the reactant is. So we do know it's food, but how do we write our reaction for that? So first, let's write down what we've figured out so far, and then we'll take a step back. So what have we figured out so far? So I'm going to use two different colors just so that it's easier. So we are looking at energy right now. This is an energy graph. So our inputs, remember, are the first thing. So it's food and oxygen. Those are the inputs. And then our outputs down here is carbon dioxide and water. And those are the outputs. Oh, sorry, I wanted to write it up here. And there's a decrease in energy. So we know that energy is released and it's used for life processes. Some other things that we want to remember is that O2 is oxygen. and H2O is the water. And then one last review is that our food So remember, our food is made up of proteins, lipids, fats, and carbohydrates. So we figured that out last time when we looked at what was our food made out of with Calorie King and all that other stuff. All right, so then if we take a step back, what happens to that hamburger or a veggie burger or a turkey burger or whatever kind of burger you're eating? What happens to it after we eat it? Remember, it goes through our digestive tract. It gets broken down into those carbs and lipids, proteins. And remember, those are made up of those molecules of like carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So whatever we need gets absorbed into the bloodstream. And then whatever we don't need or whatever waste products we have comes out as our feces or our poop. But what's happening while it's through in this digestive tract? I just kind of told you it's going through and being broken down, but we kind of want to remember and talk more specifically. So just a reminder, what is the burger made of? We already just went through that. It's made up of those proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. So remember, we take in our food. So here's a picture of the mouth, and we take in our food, and it gets broken down into fats, carbs, and proteins. And it gets broken down into those polymers. Remember, those are the big units. And do you think it stops there? Do you think we just end up with fats, carbs, and proteins? No, it gets broken down into polymers, and the polymers get broken down into monomers. Remember those single units. And so those monomers, those single units, is what gets absorbed into the bloodstream. So digestion breaks the fats, carbs, and proteins down to glucose for carbs, amino acids for proteins, and fatty acid and glycerol for fats. And then it gets put into the bloodstream. So here's a photo of the bloodstream, some blood cells, and that's what gets passed on into the bloodstream. So again, this should be a review that the protein is made up of an amino acid chain, and it has those nitrogen units. The fatty acid molecule has the glycerin and fatty acid chains, and then the carbohydrate is these rings of carbon with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in all of them. So these polymers, remember, protein, carbs, and fats, get broken down into monomers or single units. The protein gets broken down into amino acid. Carbohydrates get broken down into glucose, and fatty acid or fat molecules get broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. So we will write this down in box H. So when we break it down, one more time. Carbohydrates break down into glucose. Fats break down into fatty acid. And then proteins break down into amino acids. So we need to figure out which monomer is the fuel. Is it the amino acids from proteins? Is it the glucose from carbohydrates? Or is it the fatty acids and the glycerol from fats or lipids? So which one or ones do you think is our fuel and why? And this right now is, again, your brainstorm or just your thoughts. So write down your ideas in Doodle Box I on page 53. So it says, which is our fuel and why? So just write down your ideas right there. So which is the carbon-containing fuel? Our bodies work to supply glucose to all of our cells every minute of every day. People who have difficulty regulating the amount of glucose in their blood and the amount that gets into the cells have a condition called diabetes, which we will take a closer look at. And our brains in particular require a very consistent supply of glucose. This is a huge cost of our incredible evolution. Muscles have need for lots of glucose all at once. So they store actually right in the tissues. And they even store extra oxygen, which is what makes the muscles red. So, what is the importance of glucose? Due to the human brain, our brains use about 50% of the energy we require each and every day. So, we might not be consciously thinking about it, but if you think about everything that the brain is in charge of, from our neurons, like our sensations, our pain sensors, if we can touch or feel something, if we get punched and you feel it, if you're just touching your pencil, to learning how to write, read, to listen, all those things do require your brain to like filter it and think about it. So the evolution of increased blood supply and delivery of glucose to our brains is thought to be a key step in human evolution. It allowed our brains to become larger than most mammals, but we burn more energy. So it came at a cost. The cost being that we need to expend or use more energy. So when we exercise, we don't eat as we exercise. Like if you are lifting weights, you don't stop and have a sandwich usually. And we also don't have to eat right before we exercise. Like you can work out when you're fasted, which a lot of people do. So where is this fuel coming from then in that moment when we're running, jumping, or swinging a bat? So we are going to complete a reading about glucose and exercise and answer the questions at the end of that. But overall, the importance of glucose, when we exercise, our muscles and heart, because a heart is a muscle, increase their demand for glucose, so their need for glucose. And we actually store glucose in the muscles, which I kind of said. So here are some muscles, and in the heart, you can see more of the muscles, and that's where we actually store some glucose. And then if this was a storage of glycogen, which is a form of glucose and carbohydrates, you take a little snippet of the end of the glycogen molecule, and it's just made up of a whole bunch of glucose is put together in a specific way. So when we exercise, I said that. And we also store oxygen in the muscles too, which is why the muscles are red, because the iron group, it's called an Fe iron group, holds the oxygen. And this is the same structure as seen in blood cells that carry oxygen. So it's myoglobin is a protein, that's a specific type of polymer also, and it holds on to the oxygen in our muscles. And then, do you know of any people who have had to be careful about their blood glucose? Why is that? How do we normally regulate our blood glucose? And we will read about this information in diabetes and answer the questions at the end.